Hey everybody, we are going to talk about basic boring ETFs like the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF today. It's not going to be a boring discussion, I promise. So before we dive in, please take a minute and check out the link you see on your screen, fool.com/Frankel. Get a message from my sponsor, The Motley Fool. You can get the top 10 stocks to buy right now, and it is the best way to support this work I'm doing on YouTube. Again, fool.com/Frankel, and I will put that link in the description of this video as well. So real quick, I want to share my screen. So, should you buy the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF? I own the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF in my portfolio, by the way. I think it's a great backbone to any portfolio. Warren Buffett has said that a basic low-cost ETF, like this one, he specifically called this one out and owned it for a little while in Berkshire's portfolio, is the best investment that most people can make. So there's a great argument to be made for the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF as a all-in-one long-term investment strategy. As I mentioned, I owned it in my portfolio. When friends of mine who are not, just don't have the time to research individual stocks ask me what they should put their money into, this is usually one of the few things that I tell them. Over long periods of time, the S&P 500 has averaged total returns of about 10%. Over the long term, that can really accumulate into a significant wealth generator. So it's been a solid investment, but I'd like to pitch a couple of alternatives. But first, before we do that, here's just kind of the basics of this ETF. So the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF, ticker symbol is VOO. It has $1.4 trillion of total assets under management. It's a large index fund. That includes the mutual fund version of it. But big index fund. Very low expense ratio, 0.03%. What that means is for every $10,000 you have in this fund, your annual investment costs are going to be $3. It's not a fee you have to pay. It's just reflected in performance. But the point is, because the fee is so low, you get to keep most of the gains. You're not just getting killed by fees over time. The short description, it's an obvious one. This one tracks the S&P 500 benchmark, which is widely considered to be the best barometer of how U.S. business is doing. The top 5 holdings as of February 28th were Apple, NVIDIA, Microsoft, Amazon.com, and Alphabet, as you might expect, the big tech companies. So I wanted to pitch a few alternatives. There are other ways to go if you want just kind of a backbone investment to your portfolio. One of my biggest complaints about the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF, or any S&P 500 ETF, is this: the concentrations in the big companies. I don't necessarily want, 40% of my money invested in the Magnificent Seven. I would just buy those stocks. If I wanted a 7% position in Apple, I would just buy Apple. It's really the concentration that's my biggest, pet peeve of just the S&P 500. So the obvious way to get rid of that is with my first alternative of 3. This is the Invesco S&P 500 Equal Weight ETF. The ticker symbol is RSP. A smaller ETF, but still a pretty big one at $72 billion. A little bit higher of an expense ratio, which is kind of my biggest downside of this one. That's still not high by index fund standards, but it's definitely higher than the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF. The short description of this one is that it invests an equal amount of money in all 500 components of the S&P 500. This means that smaller S&P stocks have the same exact weighting as the NVIDIAs and Apples of the world. So there are no top 5 holdings by definition, because all 500 stocks in the S&P each make up about 0.2% of this fund. Now, it rebalances every so often because, the stocks perform, some will go up, some will go down. Right now, there's Broadcom, I think, is the technical number one. It made up 0.26% of this portfolio. But the idea is that there are no top holdings. It's an equal weight ETF. And over the long term, this has actually outperformed the regular S&P 500. It's worth noting. So you might not be sacrificing as much as you think to go the equal weight route. Number 2, and this is actually really similar in makeup to the S&P 500 ETF. This is the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF. Ticker symbol is VTI. It has $1.8 trillion of total assets, so it's an even bigger fund. This includes the mutual fund version. Even bigger fund than the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF, which a lot of people think is the biggest in the portfolio. Same 0.03% expense ratio. This tracks a total market index of about 3,600 stocks. So in addition to the 500 companies that make up the S&P 500, this also invests in mid-cap stocks and small-cap stocks, micro-cap stocks. So it's a portfolio of stocks of all sizes. And what that does, the S&P 500 is something like 80% of the total stock market. So you're still mostly invested in the S&P. The difference is that these concentrations right here are a little bit lower than they are in the regular S&P 500. So if you like the S&P 500 but don't want quite as much concentration, then maybe this is one you might want to take a look at. Third, last but certainly not least, is the Vanguard Total World Stock ETF. Ticker symbol is VT. This is the smallest of the three by a pretty big margin. $56 billion in assets under management, 0.06% expense ratio, so pretty low still. This one tracks a global index of about 10,000 stocks. Now, when you're looking at ETFs, I want to point out, this is something really important for investors to know. You'll see some listed as international ETFs and some listed as global ETFs. The difference is international excludes the US. Global funds include the US. So when I say a global index of about 10,000 stocks, that means it is stocks from the US and stocks from all other countries around the world. So 10,000 of them, still a weighted index, but a lot more, dilution, I guess you would say. So if you look over here, these are about half of the concentrations you'll find in the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF. So it's a good way to get exposure to the overall stock market and international stocks, because sometimes non-US stocks perform better. So it's nice to have some exposure to them too. If you just want kind of exposure to all stocks in the world, this is a good one to look at. It's still a weighted index. It's kind of amazing that out of 10,000 stocks worldwide, Apple is almost a 4% share of it. But that's, for me, that's better than an over 7% weighting. So those are just a couple of alternatives to the S&P 500 ETF. I'm going to stop my share real quick. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with buying just the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF or any other S&P 500 ETF for that matter. It can form a great backbone to any stock portfolio. But if you're like me and just kind of don't like that much concentration in the big tech stocks, especially right now with how volatile AI is being and things like that, then maybe you want to take a look at some of these other alternatives. I'd love to hear any questions or thoughts that you might have. I'll do my best to respond individually. And thanks for watching, and stay tuned for a message from The Motley Fool. I want to thank The Motley Fool for sponsoring this video. The Motley Fool is a company that provides investing insight and stock recommendations for investors of all skill sets and risk levels. You all know how much I love researching new stocks and trying to find the next best investment. So I'm proud to partner with The Motley Fool to bring you 10 stock picks from their popular product, Stock Advisor. Stock Advisor has beaten the market by more than 5 times. Go to fool.com/Frankel to get your 10 stock picks now. The Motley Fool Stock Advisor returns are 914% as of January 7th, 2025, and are measured against the S&P 500 returns of 174% as of January 7th, 2025.